The air hung thick with the cloying scent of sugar and plastic. Pastel balloons bobbed against the ceiling, casting soft, sickly shadows. Laughter, light and brittle as spun glass, echoed around the room, punctuated by the tearing of wrapping paper and polite exclamations over tiny booties and miniature rattles. It was my sister Sarah's baby shower, a symphony of expectation and future perfect, and I was the off-key note in the corner. I stood near the refreshment table, a half-eaten mini quiche growing cold in my hand. The noise felt like static in my ears. Everyone was orbiting Sarah, radiant and round, the center of their universe, as it should be. I felt like a satellite that had spun too far out of orbit, observing from a distance, the gravity of belonging just out of reach. Aunt Carol swept towards me, her smile painted on, eyes scanning not my face, but the empty space beside me. She smelled faintly of old lavender and something sharp, like judgment. "Still alone then, darling?" she asked, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the gentle murmur around us. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the faux concern of someone twisting a knife. My smile felt stiff. "I'm enjoying the party, Aunt Carol." She leaned closer, her voice dropping slightly, but the edge remained. "Lovely. So lovely. Just makes you wonder, doesn't it? All this family connection." She gestured around the room, at the mothers, the fathers, the couples huddled together. "Some people," she sighed, a sound like deflating expectation, "just aren't built for it, I suppose. Some people are meant to observe from the sidelines." She paused, letting the words hang in the syrupy air. Her eyes held a pity so profound it felt like contempt. Then she delivered the line, the one that landed like a physical blow. "You know," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, "at your age, it's really starting to look like you'll just die alone. Like always." The laughter around Sarah seemed to grow louder, a cruel counterpoint to the sudden silence that bloomed in my chest. The colors of the room seemed to drain away, leaving only the stark white of the tablecloth and the dark void that comment opened up inside me.
Die Alone.
Like always. The words echoed, not just in my ears, but through years of feeling less than, of failed attempts at connection, of family gatherings where I was the only one without a plus one, the object of their hushed speculations and pointed questions. It wasn't just a mean comment. It was the culmination of a lifetime of their passive-aggressive pronouncements, their subtle suggestions that my worth was directly tied to my marital status and reproductive potential. It was their prophecy, spoken like fact. I stood there, frozen, the half-eaten quiche forgotten. Aunt Carol's painted smile tightened, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes before she turned and drifted back into the crowd, leaving me stranded in the sudden, deafening silence of my own head. The party raged on around me, a celebration of life and connection I was told I would never truly have. I felt the walls closing in, not of the room, but of the future she had just laid out for me, a solitary, empty horizon. If you've ever felt like the outcast, the one who doesn't quite fit the picture, tell me in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know to share these moments. The drive home was a blur of unshed tears and the suffocating weight of Aunt Carol's words. Die alone. Like always, it wasn't just her saying it. It was the collective voice of my family, the unspoken agreement that this was my inevitable fate. For years, I tried to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't sting. "Oh, I'm just too independent," or "marriage isn't for everyone." Empty platitudes I told myself more than anyone else. But deep down, the fear was always there, a cold knot in my stomach. Growing up, I was always the quiet one, the bookworm, the one who didn't chase boys or dream of white picket fences in the same way my sister and cousins did. Their lives unfolded like a blueprint: high school sweethearts, college, engagement, marriage, babies. Mine felt like a tangled mess of detours and dead ends. Every family gathering was a subtle interrogation. "Still single? Any prospects? You're not getting any younger, you know, Aunt Carol, of course, was the Grand Inquisitor, the keeper of the family's traditional values, and the self-appointed judge of anyone who deviated from them. Her own life, a picture of conventional success, stable marriage, 2 kids, a sprawling estate filled with inherited wealth and old money prestige, gave her, in her mind, the authority to pass judgment. The comment at the baby shower wasn't new in sentiment, but the bluntness, the sheer cruelty of "die alone like always" felt like a line had been crossed. It stripped away the polite facade and laid bare the family's true view of me. A failure, a statistical anomaly that needed to be corrected or, failing that, pitted and dismissed. For weeks after the shower, the words were a constant echo. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I could hear her voice. I'd walk past couples in the street, see families in parks, and feel a pang of acute loneliness, amplified by her prophecy. I tried throwing myself into work, into hobbies, anything to drown out the noise. But it was always there, a dark current beneath the surface of my life. I attempted to talk to my sister, Sarah. I thought, maybe, just maybe, she, of all people, engrossed in her own new life and happiness, could offer some perspective, some empathy. But her response was a well-meaning, yet utterly dismissive, shrug. "Oh, that's just Aunt Carol," she'd said, fussing with a tiny onesie. "You know how she is. She doesn't mean anything by it. Doesn't mean anything by it?" It felt like she had plunged her hand into my chest and squeezed my heart until it ached. It meant everything. It meant they saw me as fundamentally flawed, incomplete, destined for a sad, solitary end. It meant their acceptance was conditional, based on ticking boxes I hadn't ticked. Sarah's casual dismissal felt almost as bad as Aunt Carol's initial cruelty. It reinforced the isolation, the feeling that no one truly understood the weight of their collective judgment. I withdrew further. The thought of attending another family function, facing those pitying eyes and veiled barbs, was unbearable. I started declining invitations, making excuses. This, of course, only fueled their narrative. "Poor thing," I imagine them saying. "She's so sensitive. Must be hard, being on her own." The pressure intensified in subtle ways. My mother would call, ostensibly to chat, but the conversation would inevitably circle back to my single status. "Your cousin Brenda is engaged now, did you hear?" Or, "My friend's daughter is getting married. Such a lovely young man he is. When will you find someone like that?" It wasn't overt malice, not like Aunt Carol, but it was a constant, dripping reminder of my perceived failure. It felt like being under a microscope, my life scrutinized for signs of improvement, and finding none, deemed unsatisfactory. I felt myself starting to believe their narrative. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was meant to be alone. The thought was a cold comfort, a surrender to the inevitable they had predicted. I started building walls higher, preparing for that solitary future, trying to convince myself it wasn't a defeat, but a chosen path. But the ache remained. The loneliness wasn't just about not having a partner. It was about feeling fundamentally disconnected, even from the people who were supposed to be my family. Then I met David. He wasn't what I expected. Not the knight in shining armor who would rescue me from my spinsterhood, as my family might have envisioned, or failed to envision for me. David was quiet, observant, with kind eyes that seemed to see me, not the narrative my family had created. We met through a mutual friend, a casual coffee that turned into hours of easy conversation. He was successful, yes, but not flashy. He was deeply private about his work and his life, valuing substance over show. What struck me most about David was his quiet confidence and his complete lack of judgment. When I, hesitantly at first, shared snippets of my family dynamic, the pressure, the constant commentary on my status, he didn't offer platitudes. He just listened. And then he saw. He saw the hurt, the history, the subtle cruelty embedded in their expectations. Our relationship developed away from the prying eyes of my family. David understood my reluctance to introduce him, to subject him to their scrutiny, to risk them finding fault and using it as further proof of my poor choices. He was patient, supportive, and his presence in my life began to chip away at the walls I had built. With David, I didn't feel like the alone one. I felt seen, valued, and loved, not for ticking some societal box, but for being myself. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow dawning, a shift in perspective fueled by David's steady presence and my own growing strength. I started to see my family's judgment not as a reflection of my worth, but as a reflection of their limitations, their narrow view of what a successful life looked like. Their world revolved around appearances, status, and conforming to a rigid set of norms. My life, with its detours and unexpected paths, didn't fit their mold, and therefore, they deemed it a failure. David, in his quiet way, showed me a different world, one where success was measured by fulfillment, connection, and genuine happiness, not by outdated societal metrics. He didn't just accept me. He celebrated the parts of me my family implicitly criticized, my independence, my introspectiveness, my refusal to settle. The idea began to form, not as a petty revenge, but as a strategic reclaiming of power. My family, particularly Aunt Carol, valued property, legacy, the tangible symbols of wealth and status. Their estate, a sprawling piece of land with a historical, albeit slightly crumbling, manor house, was the epicenter of their world, the symbol of their enduring status. It had been in the family for generations, passed down through the most successful lines, i.e., those who married well and produced heirs. Aunt Carol lived there with her husband, overseeing its slow decline and fiercely guarding its legacy. It was their anchor, their pride, their most potent symbol of belonging and achievement. I mentioned, idly at first, how much the estate meant to them, how it represented everything they valued, everything they held over others. David, ever the listener, didn't say much at the time, but his eyes held a thoughtful glint. The deeper the crisis with my family became, the more they pushed, the more they questioned the seriousness of my relationship with David, the more Aunt Carol subtly, or not so subtly, hinted that I was just latching onto someone who might eventually leave me, leaving me alone again, the more determined I became. Their attempts to undermine my happiness, to drag me back into their narrative of failure, solidified my resolve. I wouldn't just prove them wrong by being happy. I would prove them wrong in a language they understood, a language of power and permanence. The estate was facing financial difficulties. It was an open secret in the family, whispered about behind cupped hands. Maintenance was costly, taxes were rising, and the inheritors weren't as flush as previous generations. There had been talk, hushed and horrified, about possibly having to sell off pieces of land, or even the unthinkable, the main house itself. Aunt Carol was vehemently against it, but the pressure was mounting. This was the opportunity. David, it turned out, was not just successful. He was extraordinarily so, and crucially, strategically minded. When I finally articulated the thought that had been brewing, what if we bought the estate? His reaction wasn't surprise, but a calm, assessing look. He saw not just the emotional significance for me, but the potential as an investment, and more importantly, the profound statement it would make. It wasn't about flaunting wealth. It was about fundamentally shifting the power dynamic, about taking the very symbol of their judgment and making it ours. It was about reclaiming my narrative, not just escaping it. The plan was set in motion. David, with his resources and his network, handled the complexities. It was done quietly, discreetly. The estate was on the market, but privately listed, seeking a buyer who understood its historical value and was willing to take on the burden. David was exactly that buyer. The family remained oblivious. They were too wrapped up in their own anxieties about the estate, in their continued pity and judgment of me. They saw what they expected to see, the same old me, perhaps temporarily distracted by a new relationship, but ultimately, still the one destined for a solitary end. They couldn't conceive of me having the means or the strategic mind to orchestrate something that would impact them so directly. The turning point crystallized into a specific date. My sister's baby's christening. Another family gathering, Another occasion where I would be on display, my life measured against their yardstick. Aunt Carol would be there, presiding over the event like the matriarch she believed herself to be, no doubt ready with another cutting remark disguised as concern. This was the perfect stage. We arrived slightly late, David and I. The church hall was filled with the usual suspects, cousins, aunts, uncles, all dressed in their Sunday best, their faces a mixture of forced smiles and familiar judgment. The air was thick with the scent of stale perfume and whispered gossip. As we entered, the room seemed to pause for a collective intake of breath. David, quiet and understated in his suit, was an unknown quantity, a disruption to their carefully ordered world. I felt their eyes on us, assessing, analyzing. Aunt Carol spotted us from across the room. Her smile, initially fixed on someone else, faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. She began to make her way towards us, navigating the clusters of relatives like a predator tracking prey. The christening ceremony itself was a blur. I held my nephew, tiny and innocent, and felt a complex mix of love for him and resentment towards the system he was being born into, the expectations that would already be placed upon him. Throughout the post-ceremony reception back at my mother's house, the tension was palpable. Whispers followed us. Eyes tracked our movements. No one dared ask directly about David, but the questions hung heavy in the air. Finally, Aunt Carol cornered me by the cake table. David was speaking quietly with my sister and her husband, observing. "Well, you brought a friend," Aunt Carol said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How nice. Though, dear, introducing him at a family event? A bit sudden, isn't it? One hopes he knows what he's getting into, with us."
And with.
Well, with your situation. Here it was. The opening. Her eyes scanned David, dismissing him with a look that said, "He won't last." Then she turned back to me, that pitying, contemptuous look firmly in place. "It's brave, I suppose," she continued, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "Trying to make something happen at this stage. But honestly, dear, after all this time, some things are just not meant to be. You really should prepare yourself. It's hard, I know, but facing facts is important. The truth is, darling, and it pains me to say it." She leaned in closer, the scent of lavender and judgment suffocating. "You are who you are, and it's becoming increasingly clear. You will die alone. It's just your destiny." The words landed, familiar and sharp as a blade, but this time, they didn't shatter me. This time they felt like a cue. A signal. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I didn't offer a weak smile or a deflection. My voice was steady, calm. "Actually, Aunt Carol," I said, the softness in my tone completely at odds with the steel in my eyes. David had moved closer, now standing just behind my shoulder. "There's something we needed to announce. Something important." All eyes turned to us. The room, moments before buzzing with conversation, fell silent. Aunt Carol's painted smile remained, but a flicker of unease crossed her face. She clearly expected some minor announcement, perhaps about my job or a trip I was taking. Nothing that would challenge her narrative.
"We,
David and I, have recently finalized a significant purchase," I continued, speaking clearly, addressing the room now, not just her. My mother gasped softly. My sister looked confused. Aunt Carol's smile wavered. "Yes," David said, his voice quiet but carrying authority. He placed a hand gently on my back. "It's something we're very excited about. A property with a lot of history. We closed on it this morning." Aunt Carol straightened, her eyes narrowing. "A property? What property?" She clearly suspected a small apartment, a cottage perhaps. Nothing of consequence in their world. I took a deep breath, letting the moment hang in the air. The silence was absolute now, everyone watching, waiting. I looked directly at Aunt Carol, at her smug certainty, at the years of judgment etched onto her face. "It's the estate," I said, my voice clear and strong. "Your estate, Aunt Carol." And Uncle Richard's, the main house, and all the land. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. The collective gasp that followed was deafening. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My sister's eyes went wide. Cousins exchanged stunned glances. And Aunt Carol. Aunt Carol froze. The color drained from her face, leaving it a mask of pasty white. Her mouth, fixed in that condescending smile moments before, hung slightly open. Her eyes, moments ago filled with judgmental pity, were wide with disbelief, staring blankly as if she couldn't process the information. She didn't move. Not a flicker, not a twitch. She was a statue, carved in shock, surrounded by the ruins of her own carefully constructed narrative. The silence stretched, thick with the impossible reality of my words. It wasn't just that we had bought the estate, it was who had bought it.
Me.
The one she had just declared would die alone. The one she had written off as a failure, incapable of securing a significant relationship or achieving any form of lasting success in their terms. And David, the quiet man she had dismissed as a temporary distraction, clearly far more substantial than she had ever imagined. Uncle Richard, standing nearby, spluttered. The estate? That's impossible. It wasn't on the open market.
Who? How?
David stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding. It was a private sale, he said smoothly. We finalized the paperwork this morning. It's a beautiful property. We're looking forward to becoming its new custodians. Custodians. The word was loaded. It implied care, responsibility, a future. Everything Aunt Carol had just denied me. Aunt Carol remained frozen, her eyes fixed on me, but seeing nothing. It was as if her brain had short-circuited, unable to reconcile the person she believed me to be with the reality of the situation. The girl who would die alone had just bought the very foundation of her world, the symbol of everything she used to measure worth and belonging. The silence finally broke, replaced by a chaotic murmur of shocked questions, disbelieving exclamations, and awkward attempts to understand. My mother was torn between shock and something that looked suspiciously like dawning pride. My sister seemed genuinely happy for me, once the initial shock wore off. But Aunt Carol remained frozen. The party continued around her, a surreal scene of celebration overlaid with the seismic shockwave we had just unleashed. She stood there, a monument to her own shattered certainties, her prophecy about my solitary end rendered absurd by the reality of David standing beside me and the knowledge that we now owned the ground she stood on. In the aftermath of the christening chaos, the air felt strangely still. Aunt Carol remained in her frozen state for what felt like an eternity before her husband gently guided her away, murmuring apologies and explanations that no one heard or cared about. She didn't look back. The rest of the evening was a blur of awkward congratulations, stunned questions, and a palpable shift in the family dynamic. The pity in their eyes was replaced by something else, respect, perhaps, or maybe just plain, bewildered shock. The narrative had been irrevocably broken. Driving home with David, the silence in the car was a welcome contrast to the noise of the past few hours. It wasn't awkward, it was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "You okay?" David asked, his voice soft. I nodded, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. "Yeah," I whispered. "More okay than I've been in a long time." There was a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Vindication, certainly. The cold satisfaction of seeing Aunt Carol's smugness evaporate, of shattering her cruel prophecy with such undeniable force. But there was also an underlying sadness. This victory, this turning of the tables, had come at the cost of irrevocably changing, perhaps even damaging, my relationship with my family. They would never look at me the same way again. The judgment might still be there, but it would be tinged with resentment, perhaps even fear. We didn't buy the estate out of malice, not really. Not just for revenge. It was a complex decision, born out of opportunity, strategic thinking, and yes, a deep-seated need to prove that their narrow, judgmental view of me was wrong. It was about reclaiming my power, about showing them that my life, unconventional as it might be in their eyes, was not a failure. That connection and happiness didn't have to look like their carefully curated picture. Owning the estate, the symbol of their tradition and status, felt significant. It wasn't just property, it was a statement. A statement that I was not defined by their expectations, that my worth was not measured by whether or not I fit their mold, that I was capable of building my own future on my own terms, with someone who saw and valued me for who I truly was. The "die alone" comment had been meant to diminish me, to reduce my life to a sad, solitary endpoint. But in their attempt to predict my future, they had failed to see the present, or the potential for change. They had been so focused on my perceived lack, they had missed the quiet strength I had built, the loving partnership I had found, and the strategic opportunity that presented itself. My life didn't suddenly become perfect because I bought an estate. Family dynamics don't mend overnight, and the scars of years of judgment don't disappear. But the weight felt lighter. The prophecy had been disproven, not by finding just any partner, but by finding one who stood with me, who saw my worth, and who helped me reclaim my narrative in a way that was undeniable, even to the most stubbornly judgmental eyes. Aunt Carol's frozen face that day is etched in my memory. It wasn't just shock, it was the look of someone whose entire worldview had been instantly dismantled. Her words, meant to sentence me to a lonely future, had instead become the catalyst for a profound shift, a turning point that proved her utterly, spectacularly wrong. I didn't die alone. I was standing right there, surrounded by the awkward silence of a family reckoning, with the man who saw my light standing beside me and the keys to their kingdom in my hand. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about visibility. It was about finally being seen and seeing myself, not through their distorted lens, but through my own eyes, clear and unburdened. The estate is beautiful, filled with history and the ghosts of generations past. We're restoring it, breathing new life into old stones. It's a responsibility, a challenge, and a constant reminder of how far I've come from that corner of the baby shower, feeling like an outcast, sentenced to a lonely fate. Sometimes when I walk the grounds, I think of Aunt Carol. I don't feel malice anymore, just a quiet understanding of the limitations that had defined her life and her view of mine. Her prophecy didn't come true. And in the end, the real loneliness wasn't mine, but the kind that comes from living in a world so small, you can't see the possibilities beyond your own limited horizon. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt judged or underestimated, you're not alone. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life.